So in this podcast, our goal is to see the failure of democracy in Europe from the period of 1919 to 1939 and what factors caused that. In addition, we're going to be making a distinction between what it means to be an authoritarian government versus a totalitarian government. After the Treaty of Versailles and the Paris Peace Conference, virtually every single country in Europe was a democracy. It was established to be a democracy. And we see the rise of parliamentary systems throughout this whole region. It was a big push of Woodrow Wilson. It was viewed as a success as overall. But by 1939, very few still exist, particularly in terms of the new countries, the new democracies. Only Czechoslovakia remained to be a democracy until Hitler's invasion. The rest did fall to a form of totalitarian rule or authoritarian rule. And so why did that happen? Why did they fail? Well, overall, there was little tradition of liberalism or parliamentary politics in these countries. And when we think about it in our own country, getting things done through a democratic process takes time. It's a process to make sure every voice is heard, to make sure there's compromises to get the votes done. And ultimately, when there's a compromise, no one side wins. No one really wins in a democracy. No one feels successful. Things move slowly. And particularly when you think about a time of an economic depression or a time when there's economic hardships, to get things done and to resolve, you want to respond quickly. And democracies often can't. They just can't mobilize in that same way. Now imagine a country that never had any kind of experience with democracy in the past. They were used to having a monarchy and a totalitarian rule, and now all of a sudden facing those same challenges in the first few years of democracy. It's very difficult. Also in Eastern Europe in particular, these states are widely agrarian and pretty much rural. And so you still have these large landowners who are wealthy, who are controlling much of the land, and then you have peasants who are working on that land. So particularly in the case of Eastern Europe, those large landowners are very fearful of the rise of communism in their countries. And so they are willing to see anyone who would prevent a communist uprising, who would be able to establish some kind of order to prevent communism from rising. The Treaty of Versailles also promised self-determination and promised to allow for different nationalities to be recognized, but ultimately completely failed to do so. You do see in many places ethnic rivalries within these countries really bubbling up and really creating a conflicting area. The Balkans is a great example, but it's not just there. I mean, even in Poland, you have areas in Poland that would still identify themselves as German, even though they're now ruled by Poland, or they would identify as being part of the Russian Empire, even though they're now under Polish rule. So fearful of all of this, right? Powerful landowners, the middle class, and the church, who feel also threatened by the Soviet Union and that overthrow of the church power. They're all starting to look to authoritarian governments in order to maintain the old system. And we see this in Poland, we see this in Hungary and Romania. Only Czechoslovakia, as I said prior, maintained its democracy. And the reason why is really because of Czechoslovakia's unique position in its economy and society. It had a strong middle class. That was an educated middle class and an industrial base that the rest of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire just didn't have. And Thomas Masaryk, who was the president at the time, is able to keep an alliance between the different major players. So he's able to balance the demands of the church, the demands of socialists, as well as agrarians and the peasants themselves. And so it's a dance that he's able to maintain, and it was a skillful leader that also helped Czechoslovakia remain a democracy at this time of crisis. So now I want to just take a moment to discuss the difference between authoritarian rule and totalitarian rule. Authoritarian governments have wide police powers. They control over all of the people, but they limit the participation of the masses with the goal of maintaining a traditional social order. So authoritarian is what we really have studied in the past, where you have one ruler, like a Louis XIV, dominate the people, tell them what to do, and the people serve the ruler, and the ruler demands of the people. In a totalitarian government, you still have those wide policing powers, you still control the masses, but your goal is actually to have active citizenship, active involvement of the people in the goals of the regime. So this is creating a mass movement to establish what they would describe as a new society. And so totalitarian governments use their people, use mass propaganda to control all aspects of life. And it's led by a single leader and party member, and that leader is its devotion of the people. The dynamic is different there. It's not that you have a ruler suppressing the people. The ruler is using the people as a part of their power, as a way of increasing their power and loyalty. I could say your first totalitarian ruler, you could argue, could be like a Napoleon, who was able to really attract the love of the masses in a lot of ways. And use of propaganda and use of this mass movement to help get the will of the people, reflecting them. Mussolini is going to be a great example of this. He will extend the government beyond the reach of what it had been. He expects active loyalty, commitment of its citizens, the use of mass propaganda. They also have control over economic, political, social, intellectual, and cultural aspects of life. You see a single party as well as a single ruler leading that party. And they reject the concept of individual freedoms or a limited government in order to have a collective will of the masses. And that will is determined by the masses. In the interwar period, fascism, extreme nationalism, racist ideologies, the failure of appeasement resulted in the catastrophe of the World War II and really presented a grave challenge to European civilization. And it's in this realm that we're going to spend some time. So what I'd like us to do today, in particular, is spend a little bit of time talking about the differences between and the similarities between the theoretical ideas of communism and fascism. So communism. Communism, otherwise known as Marxism, scientific socialism. By the way, just as an aside, we're now looking at the Instant History, Communism and Fascism by Alice Grant. I'm really just going to be reading it over with you. You can follow along. I gave you most of these notes built in, and I'm just going to make a few comments, but it's pretty much me reading the sheet. I'm going to recognize that right now. So you can fast forward this if you'd rather just sit and read for a little bit. So communism, Marxism, or scientific socialism, the path to achieve communism had to start first with revolution, then to create a dictatorship of the proletariat with the goal of a classless society. Now, as we know, in an actual communist society, like the Soviet Union, we never move beyond the dictatorship of the proletariat. And that dictatorship of the proletariat, it's not really the proletariat. It's not a dictatorship of the working people. Instead, it's the dictatorship of the vanguard, the main leader, and that leader first being Lenin and then Stalin. In the case of fascism, the way it came into power was many times through electoral means, but also through coups, through military coups. Mussolini really marched his troops into Rome and took over, seized that power. He was eventually given legal recognition through plebiscites and votes, but his first seizure of power was a seizure of power. And in Spain, Franco too was a claim to power, a coup, and then from there gaining legitimacy through winning the Civil War. In terms of their emphasis, in communism, it's an emphasis on ideology, to believe in the cause, to believe in communism, to become good citizens of the society. Where to be good comrades, that's the word. For fascism, it's a program of action, to constantly be mobilizing, to be in a state of doing. There's a great short story called No Time to Think. And it's the idea that at this time when we ask, like, how in the world did so many people in Germany align themselves with these ideas and the Nazi beliefs? It's the idea that it was always moving. You always had to be doing, always do without stopping to really think and reflect. There was no individual thinking in either case. But in the fascist world, there's no thinking. You just act, and you just act upon emotion. In terms of for the nation state, In traditional communism, and this won't be the case with Stalin, who tried to believe in communism in one state and one nation, but there's really a rejection of the nation state, and instead an appeal for the international cause. And so a call for the workers of the world to unite, and the idea of the state withering away. Whereas in fascism, it's a glorification of the nation, and that there's a call for imperialism, that we have a right, we have a call to have a nation state be created and then to be able to be expanded. With that hand in hand, fascism is based and founded upon imperialism. We must expand our nation. We must benefit the people that live within there. So under Mussolini, you see the desire to recreate the glories that was ancient Rome, right? We're going to rule the Mediterranean Sea once again. For Hitler, it's a call for Lebensraum, or an idea of living space, that German people need more space than what they actually have now. We need more space to be able to expand. So in both cases, we see this desire to expand, and imperialism is a valid cause and call to action. Under communism, because there's an international appeal and eventually national borders should just wither away, there was a rejection of imperialism. Imperialism instead was interpreted as the highest form of capitalism, that it's the one final march towards this capitalist cause, right? That we need more markets, more raw materials. Communism desires to appeal to the workers, to reject class interests, to reject capitalism. Fascism appeals to the middle class. That's the group that is most drawn to and that was targeted in the fascist policies. And they pit themselves against communists as a way of appealing to that middle class. So they do have control. The state does control the means of production, but they protect the profit of individual businesses. So what do I mean by this? In order to own a private business, you must be a party member. So in that way, and to be a party member means you do not question the party line. And so that was the case in Germany. If you wanted to have any kind of business, where it was a small grocery store, if you were running the railway line, you had your own private business, but you were also a party member. And so in that exchange, in that dynamic, you were part of the state policy, but also protecting your own private interests and profits. In Stalin and in the Soviet Union, that's not the case, right? There's a rejection of that private property and a rejection of any kind of personal ownership of businesses. In communism, Marx rejects any kind of leadership. Once again, though, we're seeing Stalin totally rejecting that concept, right? He is the leader of the Soviet Union. But in fascism, outright, the policy of fascism is the importance of the party elite and the leader himself. And so that person, that ruler, then becomes glorified in a lot of ways. And finally, for the ideal. In communism, the ideal would be a democratic, classless society without any kind of forced coercion. Everyone's working to benefit the whole, but no one's being forced to do so. The dictatorship and state control of the means of production is just a temporary phase to the means of the ideal. You know, that never happens, though. So just keep that in mind. For fascism, there's a rejection of democracy. Democracy is what creates all these problems. It gives power to minorities who are not really representing the views of the people. And instead, there's a need for force, for violence, for war as a means to achieve the goals, and to be able to prove that superiority. And so we see within the fascist policies a real strong influence of social Darwinism, racism, and irrationalism. I want to take a moment just to talk about that irrationalism. It's not to think. It's not what to respond with your head. Instead, it's to engage emotions. And so Hitler will create these huge spectacles, these moments where you lose your own individualism. Everyone in this scene, this is the Nuremberg rallies. And this is a really interesting place today. It's very controversial because this place, this huge venue, massive, massive space, still exists. And a lot of the structures are still there. Famously, there's a swastika above on this little platform up here, this grave here. There's a statue made out of stone of a swastika that the American government bombed. And so that's destroyed. It was like a public, there's a video of the bombing of it, right? They exploded it. But this is where Hitler stood. He stood right here. And you can still go to Nuremberg and you can go and stand here and look out and see this party grounds, this rally grounds. And it's eerie. It's very, very eerie to stand there. And there's a question of what do we do with this? Not modern day. What do we do with this space? Do we create it as a memorial? Do we preserve it as a memorial? Do we destroy it? Do we build condos on it? Should people be able to just live here? So what they've just sort of done as a city, the city of Nuremberg, sort of just let it decay. But it's a really fascinating case study of what do we do with our past and how do we manage it all. So this is the Nuremberg party rallies. This was an example, though, I want to now come back to that idea of engaging in the emotion. So it was a major gathering of people from all across Germany. Every single job was invited, and like a group was invited to represent themselves there, and every job was given its own uniform. So if you were a farmer, you were given a certain, style shirt, and you were given a shovel to symbolize that you were a farmer, right? And if you were a student, you were put in a Nazi youth uniform. Every single job was militarized. And it was the idea that no matter what role you had, you were serving the state. And that sort of mindset then gave you a role, gave you a position, and you start to lose your own individual identity. And I'm just representing one of the farmers. And I am a farmer, and I will act to serve my country because I supply the food of my country. And we should celebrate that as a greater cause. In a similar way, it's what we do with Olympics, right? Everyone wears the same color. You all cheer together as your class, as your grade. Day to day, your best friends might all be juniors. And you might socialize them with all the time. But on that one day of Olympics, you were united with this greater group. And sort of the rationalism of it all sort of fades away. And things start to feel very important that might not really rationally make sense. So in terms of going back to the communism-fascism divide, although theoretically we have differences, as I've already emphasized enough, Stalin is not theoretically a communist. He does not follow those policies. And instead, in terms of policies, in terms of day-to-day life, although politically they are completely on opposite ends of the spectrum, the policies of the world are very similar. We see in both the importance of the state. Stalin has socialism in one country as the big emphasis there. And there's the importance of the leader. Stalin as this dictator, prophet, ruler, right, the central ruler. There's the importance of the totalitarian elite, that the party membership and the elite in the party membership have precedence, are the most important. And then we see also the role of the individual in relation to the state, and that your individual rights don't matter anymore. Civil rights fade away, and instead we see in both societies the use of secret police, the use of terror to silence any kind of oppression. In both countries, we have the control of education, as well as the media to help manipulate the masses, the use of film to construct false histories and false memories, the rejection of democracy in general, the manipulation of electoral and legislative processes in order to achieve their goals. We'll take a look and see how Hitler was able to manipulate the elections to be able to regain more power. The state control of the economy, especially, although we don't see it, the state control of the economy in manipulative ways, right? That in both cases, the government is running all parts of the society. In Hitler, although in Germany, although the railroads were private companies, they built railroads that went straight into the concentration camps. That there was a partnership between the state and private businesses there, where the government does have control over these private enterprises. In both cases, ideology becomes the new religion. That the government, that the mindset of whatever the government's beliefs are, becomes the new norm in the group. And imperialism, although in communist writings it was against imperialism, we see an expansionary justification in Stalinist Russia, in the Soviet Union, because we need to expand communism to avoid capitalist encirclement, so that they need to protect against capitalism, so we must expand into other territories. And really, since the civil war with the Soviet Union, they're looking to expand over other territories that they had lost since World War I. Fascist ideology offers simple solutions to complex problems. They have the idea that the nation is destiny. It's all about efficiency. This government is meant and designed to be efficient. Mussolini's phrase about Mussolini is that he made the trains run on time, right? That's a common phrase about it. That there's a need for strong leadership against this communist threat. And in Germany in particular, a lot of it's both against communism, but also against Judaism. That Judaism is also another internal enemy that must be removed. And so the fascists have very different attitudes about different things. So in terms of the individual has to be subordinate to the state to rule in the interest of the state. The state itself, fascism is a nationalist movement. The state interests are before anyone else, before your family, before the individual, and you glorify the state and place the state's interests first. If you were to oppose fascism, any opposition to fascism must be eliminated. And so we see extreme censorship. There is no free speech whatsoever. And we see a secondary group to police this opposition force. So in Italy, we have the black shirts by Mussolini, right? The secondary paramilitary force. And in Germany, it's called the Einsatzgruppen. And those two groups are sort of these secondary sources for terror and to be able to eliminate opposition. In terms of law and justice, you must conform to party ideology. So the state itself is the ultimate judge of right and wrong. Right is whatever the state's interests lie. So there's no sense of true justice or even true law, because the state's interest is the leader's interest. And so you need to obey whatever the ruler has decided. So any kind of parliamentary action is really reduced to just merely a formality. Education's function is to promote conformity to the state. Atheism also becomes a main fascist policy, and Mussolini does establish a deal with the Pope to make the Catholicism the primary religion of Italy. But religion itself is sort of secondary to the state. The nationalism is taught in schools, and so there's sort of a withering away of religious values. Between the party and the state, we're seeing a one-party totalitarian state. No party but the fascist party is allowed, and therefore it's not a freely elected government. Fascists provide a single leader with whom all allegiance is owed, and so in that election, there's only that one member that you can vote for. They will emphasize an equality of mankind, but what they're doing is they're maintaining class structure. So they're eliminating class conflict by controlling the classes, by controlling the group, and they're protecting the economic interests of the middle class and economic elite. And if you complain about it, you're going to be removed from society. And there's a strong belief in the national or racial superiority, that they want to free all nations from all economic dependency on other nations, that we should not be dependent upon anyone but ourselves. And so this desire for self-sufficiency was part of this notion that our nation is superior to all others. There's a strong vein of irrationality, right? We reject reason. Don't think for yourself. Just obey party orders. Don't think about those orders or what they might mean. The use of force, war is a policy, right? It is a need, according to these fascist states, that war is necessary for their strength. And in terms of freedom, there is very limited freedom, right? There's censorship, limited free speech and opinion, the use of secret police, no labor organizations are permitted, and they safeguard private property, protecting the business leader. Fascists are against democracy, socialism, and communism, but fascists are for, in favor of nationalism, racism, imperialism, dictatorship, and paramilitary organizations. Fascism certainly built upon the nationalism that arose in the 19th century, Without the modern technologies of the 20th century, it would never have really existed. It relied upon this new modern technology, propaganda, and the questioning of democratic institutions as a way of being able to lure people, and particularly the disillusioned at this time. And without the charismatic leaders leading these groups, they also wouldn't have gained the same traction. So it's particularly important to recognize the role of time and space, and how the context of post-World War I Europe helps lead to the rise of these fascist powers and how this ideology could possibly exist. So with that, we'll end today, and have a great one. I'll post a few questions to go along with these as we go. Take care. Bye.